Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack, where today I'm trying something slightly different, partially because I don't understand editing software and my children aren't here to assist me. We're going to be doing this somewhat live and unplugged, so if I drop something and say, oh bugger, that's all part of what it's meant to be. And today, well, it's me, I'm back, so we must be talking about some form of naval history. And we're going twigs and string this week. We are talking to Jacqueline Reiter, who has a writer and historian, whose previous book was on the late Lord, the life of John Pitt, the second Earl of somewhere called Chatham. I'm not aware of it, but I'm sure it exists somewhere. But she's here today to talk about her new book, The Quicksilver Captain, The Improbable Life of Sir Home Popham. So, Jacqueline, welcome to History Hack. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, not a problem. Now, I'm going to be honest. Obviously, this is out of my period, and there's not a German cruiser or U-boat to be sighted for quite some miles. And I wasn't aware of this person's existence from the very beginning. So I'm going to ask the really obvious question: who is Sir Home Popham, and why is he important?
Well. Yeah, you're not the only one who hasn't heard of him, although he does pop up quite a lot in Napoleonic history. So quite a lot of Napoleonic people won't recognise him either, but they'll probably have come across him or something that he was involved in some form. He was a naval captain, British Navy, during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. But despite the fact that he was a post captain for most of the wars, he played a surprisingly prominent part in the formation of British global and imperial strategy during the period. So he's a pretty interesting guy. I'm quite surprised that there hasn't been more written on him. There was a biography written on him about 30 years ago. So he's overdue a reassessment, really.
Yeah, 30 years is quite some time. Probably is. And it's a good thing you have written a reassessment of him.
He definitely did need returning to, shall we say?
Yeah. And but he's quite a controversial figure as well, isn't he?
Oh yes, definitely. Yes, if you have heard of him, you've probably heard of him in one of two scenarios. Either you've heard of him because he invented a signal code, which became very famous, or you've heard of him because he went off without orders to South America in 1806 and pretty much single-handedly invaded Buenos Aires and got into big trouble. That wasn't the only reason he was controversial. He was also a smuggler in his spare time when he wasn't in the Navy. Of course, he would have said he was a merchant trader, but he was busily undermining the East India Company monopoly in the Indian Ocean. So I think smuggler fits quite well.
Legitimate businessman.
Yes, and he had a bit of a reputation for being a bit sticky-fingered, shall we say. Although I'm not entirely sure that is 100% earned. I think that a lot of that comes from his smuggling days. But he definitely had an eye for a controversial spat, shall we say, and he got into quite a lot of trouble over the years.
Beyond sort of his... Sorry, in my head, I've just got Fat Tony and the legitimate businessman thing from The Simpsons.
Yeah.
We legitimately came by all this equipment. It's nothing to do with the East India Company.
That was very much his. Yes, he would have definitely used a similar sort of language, I think. Absolutely, this hold of Chinese calico, absolutely above board, and the East India Company knows everything about what I'm doing. Absolutely, it does.
And here is your bag of change.
Exactly.
But it makes perfect sense in a way for a naval man to have an interest in merchant trading and shipping.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he was the only naval personality of the period to go into private trade. I think even Nelson might have dabbled in it at one point, but I think he went a bit further than most, shall we say?
Yeah.
in his risk taking. And in fact, in terms of risk taking, he didn't do particularly well in the long run, because his merchant vessel was actually seized as a prize in 1793 by a Royal Navy vessel.
Oh, whoops.
Yeah, that was the end of his trading career. Luckily, it was at the start of the war with France, so he was able to petition to be put back on the list of lieutenants. And amazingly, the Admiralty did it.
Oh, wow.
I really don't know how he managed it, but he was quite good at bending people's ears, shall we say.
Extracting himself from trouble.
Yes, he was extremely good at that. He had a lot of practice.
Oh, we all know someone like that.
Oh yeah. He was. I described him in my book as a chaos magnet, and I stand by that. I think it was a good description for him.
Well, yeah, he does seem to get himself into quite a lot of sticky scrapes and
Yes.
controversy.
Yep.
Whether by design or just bad luck.
I think mostly bad luck. I think he did take a lot of risks. I think he was a risk taker, and I think I'm going to put it out there. I'm going to say that's why his career did so well in the initial days, because he was a risk taker, and the people who were employing him liked that. They liked people who took risks, and because risks sometimes came up trumps.
Yeah.
And sometimes they didn't, but that's all part of the game.
Oh, absolutely. It's just if your risks don't come through and it keeps coming badly, that you find yourself a different employer or not advancing. You've got to pull it off from time to time.
Yes, indeed. And now we're at the end of the book.
Thanks for coming.
That was fast. Right, okay. Let's go get some coffee.
Yay. But talking of risks, he's a bit of an amphibious warfare expert at the time, because you wouldn't necessarily think of this period as being amphibious war. I mean, a lot of people would think, well, sort of D-Day, Dieppe. People like me would think Moon Sound in the First World War, but you wouldn't necessarily think of sort of the age of musket and shot, that people be jumping in and out of boats on beaches.
Well, given that Britain was a naval power and had an empire over the globe, actually there was quite a lot of amphibious activity at the time. And in fact, for much of the war, Britain was sending troops to places they could reach, which essentially meant places they could reach by water. So there were a lot of amphibious expeditions, and Popham was involved in most of them. Not all of them. But he was involved in a lot of the big ones, shall we say. Most might be a slight exaggeration. In fact, a friend of mine is doing a PhD on amphibious expeditions during the war, and I forget how many he arrived at. It was a lot. It might even have been 3 figures, but I think it was counting some very small ones as well. So having an amphibious expert was quite a useful thing, and in some ways it's quite amazing to think that Popham was one of the main amphibious experts. You'd have thought there'd be more of them. And I'm sure there were. I'm sure he was jumping up and down going, I am the only amphibious expert worth employing. And he certainly was the amphibious expert that the government trusted the most. So there's that. But that was how he managed to get himself to prominence, because having rejoined the Navy in 1793, he was obviously not exactly flavour of the month. They made him a transport agent, which I don't know if things changed for transport agents, but in 1793 it was very much a dead-end job, no promotion prospects whatsoever. And he was only a lieutenant at the time. So he decided that the only way he was going to get noticed was by making himself an expert in something. And so he managed to master the practice of getting troops on and off ships across boggy ground. This came in very useful because the British Army was in Flanders at the time, which was a lot wetter then than it is now. And so during that campaign in Flanders, he made himself so indispensable that the Duke of York, the Commander-in-Chief himself, noticed him and essentially got him promoted to post captain, and he was one of, and this is one of the few things in Popham's life that is indisputable. He definitely was primarily responsible for evacuating the British troops from Flanders and Germany back to Britain in 1796, which he did successfully, and that was pretty much what made his reputation. And then he stayed with amphibious operations on and off for the rest of his career. He was the go-to guy.
Yeah, and if you can make yourself indispensable in certain areas, and as you said, people are always going to call you up and go, we need this. Mm-hmm. We're going to do something amphibious. We need to get Popham in on this.
This is pretty much how it went. In fact, there's a letter from a few years down the line where someone said, we've got this big amphibious expedition coming up. Someone get Popham! So it was exactly like that.
Yeah, it's just getting your name attached to things. But it also helps if you've got like a sponsor or someone higher up as well who can put your name in. And he was quite close to Sir Henry Dundas, wasn't he?
Yes, Henry Dundas, who later became first Viscount Melville. Yes. In the 18th century Navy, you really had to have a sponsor of some description in the Navy to, help argue your cause at the Admiralty and get you employment. It helped. Popham in the 1780s didn't have one. That was partly why he left the Navy in 1786. But when he came back after he'd become the blue-eyed boy in Flanders, he came to the notice of Henry Dundas, who at the time was one of the most important members of the government. He was Pitt the Younger, who was the Prime Minister. He was Pitt the Younger's right-hand man, effectively, and he was also Secretary of State for War, so definitely a big name to cultivate. And Dundas had a big thing about, what we would now call blue water strategy. I presume your listeners are familiar with the term, but if they're not, effectively that means attacking the enemy in their colonies, expanding your own colonies, protecting your colonies, using your navy to defend both the homeland and the colonies abroad. So a very global idea of the war. Dundas was much more global in vision than many of his colleagues in the cabinet. So someone like Popham really worked well with Dundas because Popham had been all over the world, legally and illegally, and he knew a lot of places quite intimately. So he was very familiar with the Indian Ocean, which was very important for India. He had been to Africa, so he knew the coast around, I think it was mostly the east side of Africa, but he pretended to know both sides, obviously. He was the expert in everything. And he was very familiar with Europe as well, so he was very versatile. And it was Dundas who gave Popham most of his employment. The Admiralty never really warmed to Popham. For much of the 1790s, in fact, they continued to view him as a transport agent. They almost pretended that he wasn't a post captain because he never actually had a ship. He didn't have a ship for several years after he'd been made a post captain. So he'd never actually captained a ship until 1798, I think. They didn't like him that much. So most of his employment came from Dundas, and Dundas didn't just like to give him naval stuff, didn't just like the amphibious stuff. Dundas had much broader ranging ideas for Popham, and he got him involved in all sorts of shenanigans. He acted as an unofficial diplomat on more than one occasion. It gets quite complicated, but it's really rather fun as well because I'm sorry, I'm taking you off the boat.
No, that's fine. No, because a lot of people forget how much the Royal Navy or navies in general actually do a lot more than just mess about in boats.
Yeah,
so I think it's good to show that.
I think the thing about Popham, though, is that he rarely messes about in boats. In fact, a friend of mine who writes novels under the name Lynn Bryant, she and I have this running joke that Popham is never found on his own ship, which is actually kind of true. um,
Not since his arrest.
well, after his arrest, actually, we'll talk about that in a minute, I'm sure. But he did stay on a ship more. But before that, there were lengthy periods of time where he wasn't actually on his ship, and he did get into trouble for it on more than one occasion. But yes, he's not your ordinary naval captain. I think you're probably getting that by now.
Which again makes him more interesting, because you get a lot of sort of Nelson's sort of chosen few are always on their ship and they care about their ship. So you get a captain who's like, yeah, I'll do it later.
Yeah.
I've got more interesting things to do. Almost the Hornblower-esque. Right, I'm going to go off and do this. But sir, the ship, yeah, later. It just makes it more interesting.
Mm. I think, speaking of fictional captains, I think Popham was one of the inspirations behind Captain Aubrey. I think he was mostly modelled on Cochrane, Lord Cochrane, but apparently Popham was also there in the background as a, and you can kind of see that.
Yeah, because both he and Cochrane have got that kind of free spirit, sort of, well, bugger it, I'm going to go and do it myself, and I will go, and just taking charge rather than just sort of waiting for instructions. And
Yeah.
I think that makes it more interesting. I'm always much more drawn to commanding officers who are likely to make their own decisions than to sit around and wait for the Admiralty to send them instructions.
I think they're the ones who have gone down in history in many ways, because either they get it completely right or they get it disastrously wrong. I guess Popham is kind of a mix of both of those.
Well, yes.
We're back to the taking risks thing.
Yes. I've had this saying since I was a teenager, that there is a thin line between bravery and stupidity, marked only by success. And I always end up talking about Custer, because he was in the Civil War. He did all these reckless cavalry charges, and they were successful, so he's a hero. Then he does the same in the Indian War and gets himself killed, and he's an idiot.
Yeah.
But for Popham, he always seems to get through, doesn't he?
Mostly, and now we're at the end of the book again. Another way I described him in the book is that he's a cat who always lands on his feet.
Yes.
And again, I think that is definitely true for him. He took these risks, and in most people, it would have destroyed their career at some point. It took a long time to catch up with Popham, a long time. But yeah, risks could be good, as I said, but also,
as long as they work.
Yeah, exactly. If they work, no problem. And Popham's worked occasionally.
Yeah, but Buenos Aires, not so much.
No. Do you want me to talk about Buenos Aires?
I know, I'm kind of skipping ahead, but it's kind of nagging me. It's like, I want to ask about being.
I think most, as I said, most people probably know him for that, if they know him for anything at all. So it is kind of his most celebrated. Hesitating to know what word to use here. Exploit. That's a nice neutral word for you, isn't it?
I was going to say cock up, but yeah, exploit's probably the politer one.
Yeah, it's one of those cases where you have the risk. Popham was all about taking risks. And Buenos Aires is the big risk of his career. It's sometimes portrayed as something that he did just off the cuff, completely unauthorized. And yeah, he wasn't authorized to do it in the strictest sense of the word authorized. But it had been mooted in the past between him and Dundas, and also Pitt, the Prime Minister. The three of them had been cooking up a plan to attack South America, not necessarily Buenos Aires specifically, but somewhere in South America, to hit the Spanish, who were current at that point enemies. Think Trafalgar. But then Pitt decided that he wanted to try and win Spain over. He was building the third coalition against France at the time. He decided that Spain might be likely to change sides, so he said, "Hold fire, don't go, wait until I've dealt with Spain." So he sent Popham to the Cape of Good Hope. Bear with me, this will get to South America eventually.
Not
and
that
and
far.
yeah, and Popham did really well on the Cape of Good Hope. He succeeded completely in the mission he had there, but it was very quick. It was only a few weeks, and he got bored, as you do when you're Popham. And he
Yeah.
started thinking, oh, South America, Cape of Good Hope, they're quite close together. What's 4,000 miles amongst friends?
Yeah.
So he decided, he persuaded the military commander, Sir David Baird, to lend him 1,500 troops, and he sailed across the Atlantic, and he decided to attack Buenos Aires anyway. By this stage, he knew that the third coalition that Pitt had been trying to build had collapsed. He also knew that Trafalgar had happened. He also expected Pitt and Dundas to stand by him, whatever happened. They would be a bit surprised when they found him 4,000 miles away from where he was supposed to be, no problem. But they were his mates. They knew what he was like. They would go with it, particularly if he was successful. What he didn't know was that Pitt was dead.
That's a bit problematic.
Yes. And he found this out about halfway there, but he was kind of committed. That he knew at this stage that he had to succeed, otherwise his career was tanked. So, well, we all know what happened next, don't we? He gets to Buenos Aires. He and the military commander, William Beresford, successfully capture the city. They capture, I think, $1.2 million in Spanish silver, which they ship back to Britain in a great big parade. Everyone's happy. Popham writes home and says to all the merchants, come out to South America. We've got this amazing new market for you. And all the ships start coming out. And about 3 weeks after they take Buenos Aires, the locals rise up against them and capture every single one of Beresford's men. And Popham is in big trouble. So, yeah, that was a risk that went horribly wrong. It did embroil Britain in South America for over another year before they were completely thrown out. In fact, they were quite before the new government, not the Pitt government, as a new government, before they knew that things had gone tits up, they were making all these grandiose plans about armies which were going to arrive on one coast of South America and meet with an army marching from the other coast of South America. Have you seen the size of that continent? They had no idea. They had no clue.
But or the mountain range that runs down the middle of it.
Yeah, and Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, was supposed to go over there, and that would have been different, wouldn't it? But none of this happened, of course. What happened was that there was this whole fleet of merchant vessels coming out to an enemy country. There were several thousand British troops now tied up in a country that they essentially couldn't defend. There's another front.
Far away from their own supplies.
Yeah. So, this should have been enough to destroy his career. Any other man would have sunk immediately under that. But somehow he didn't. He went back to Britain and he was immediately court-martialed, which he was expecting.
Yeah.
And he was court-martialed under 2 charges, one of which was sailing without orders and the other was leaving the Cape of Good Hope undefended. And he was clearly guilty of both of those.
Yes, can't really argue with that.
Yeah, he did argue with that. He argued for 4 hours, in fact, without taking a breath, because that's the kind of thing that he did. Apparently he started standing and then after 3 hours he had to sit down because he was knackered. He made a long speech about how he had been authorised to go by Pitt and Dundas, and everything was fine, tickety-boo. And in any case, there was this great thing called, what's the word I'm looking for here? Discretion, that's it. This fine thing called discretion, which underpins the entire Royal Navy. And if you just took away that discretion, the Royal Navy would fall like a pack of cards. It's all in his speech. It's marvellous. And I can't imagine the looks on the faces of the admirals on his court-martial board when they listened to that. But they went away and deliberated, and they came back and they said, guilty of both charges.
Surprise.
Yeah. But in consideration of circumstances, and I'm quoting pretty much directly here, we sentence him to be only severely reprimanded. And he is therefore reprimanded accordingly. That was it. So I don't know quite what happened there. I suspect someone had a word. There are a few possibilities. There were still British soldiers in South America, so there was a possibility that it might all come right in the end. It didn't, spoiler. So maybe they were thinking of that. Maybe they were just thinking that if it all did come right, then they would be making him into a martyr by drumming him out of the service. I don't know what they were thinking. Maybe someone really did have a word. If they did, there's no evidence that there wouldn't be. So I don't know what happened, but what happened was he was severely reprimanded and he went right back to, shenanigans.
Doing what he was doing.
Yep.
All I can think of in my head is Admiral Byng, like at the beginning of the 18th century, and what happened to him.
Yeah.
And then Popham just sort of walks up, has a crisis, causes a crisis, then just walks away with a slapped wrist. Like, hang on, we shot someone. Like,
I mean, he actually did in the course of his trial. He accused the government who had basically put him on trial. He accused them of pretty much outright of trying to commit judicial murder. He was like that, though. He said the most outrageous things, and of course they were never going to shoot him. I think after Byng, it was not going to happen again, really. But he should have been drummed out of the service. He should have been punished more, because he was blatantly guilty.
Well, absolutely.
And it was a bloody stupid thing to do.
Yeah. And 1,500 of His Majesty's soldiers are now prisoners of war.
Exactly. And they weren't particularly happy about the whole situation either. I think Beresford, he and Popham never really served again, but Beresford was definitely not a fan after 1806, shall we say.
You can't really blame him. He probably got his knuckles rapped as well, I would have thought.
I don't think he did particularly. I think he was he managed to escape from South America, and I think that kind of stood him in good stead. Bit of daring do to and bravery to cancel out all the bloody stupid stuff he did before. Baird, who was the military commander in the Cape of Good Hope, he did suffer. He was recalled spot. And I was going to say, I don't know if he ever served again. Of course he did. He served in the Peninsula, where he lost an arm. So yes, he did serve again, but he was definitely not flavour of the month for a while.
Yes, probably sent to Spain to regain his honour, sort of thing.
Possibly, yes.
But I'm probably going to upset a few people, but I'm going to say it anyway. If Wellington had gone to South America, would that have been a much more interesting campaign than the Peninsular War? Because it's not all that.
Oh, I see what you're doing here.
I'm just going to leave that there.
Stir. Things would have been very different for sure. And whether he would have then gone on to, because what happened, it would have been interesting because, of course, he wouldn't have done quite the same thing that the commander who did get sent to South America, General Whitelock, who did get cashiered, he wouldn't have done the same thing that Whitelock did. But whether he would have, because Whitelock, of course, I don't think some of your listeners probably don't know this, he was sent out with about 8,000, 10,000 men to retake Buenos Aires, and he failed absolutely spectacularly and got loads of them killed. And then he came home and he was cashiered, which I think a lot of people think should have happened to Popham. But he was definitely not the greatest of commanders, and he made lots of stupid mistakes, one of which was being about 20 miles away from the action. I don't think Wellington would have made the same mistake. I think Wellington would have, Wellesley, as he was at the time, would possibly have had a different outcome from that battle. But was it possible that that would have actually changed things massively? I don't know. Whether he would have then gone on to the Peninsula, now that's the question. And if he hadn't, the Peninsula would probably have ended up very differently.
Yeah, it would have seriously affected South American politics over the next 100 years or so, if there was a British enclave.
Oh yeah, well, Popham already did that. Yeah. Well, once the British were out, the South Americans didn't want to hand power back to the Spanish, and so it kick-started the wars of independence in what later became Argentina. So, chaos magnet. Did I mention he was a chaos
so basically, it's all his fault.
Yeah, I think you can say that. Claiming some responsibility.
Talking of responsibility, I know this question is worded slightly crazily, but so the bane of my existence at my job is putting up the signal flags on HMS Cavalier. Now, I know he's not responsible for signal flags, but he is responsible for a signal, so I am going to hold him causing chaos in my life when I have to put up those damn flags. What's the signal that he's responsible for?
I genuinely don't know if his signal code is still being used. I think it is in some permutations. I think there are some elements of it that are still being used. But yes, I mean, that's, as I said, that's the other thing that people know him for. They either know him for South America, or bad, or they know him for the signal code, good, unless you're you, in which case also bad. But Popham was one of the things that set him apart. Well, he thought it set him apart. There were lots of scientific naval people, but he thought he was the best scientific naval person, of course. But he was, from a very, very early period in his naval career, so before he even left the Navy in 1786, he had associated himself quite closely with hydrography, surveying, that sort of thing. And he was encouraged in this by his first naval captain, Captain Edward Thompson, who was a character in his own right. I won't start talking about him because I won't stop, and it's not his podcast. But he was also big on science, and he had also written a naval signal code, which he tried to get adopted by the Navy, and the Navy said no. So Popham was brought up with that sort of thing from a fairly early naval age. And in 1800, he was serving off the coast of Denmark. He was carrying the British ambassador, who was trying to stop a big war blowing up Denmark. In this case, it was successful, although a year later, Nelson had to kind of underline the deal by blowing up their ships. But that's a different story. And Popham was had to signal from his ships to the shore to communicate with the admiral. And he discovered fairly quickly that the existing naval code didn't really cover this kind of situation. It was all kind of ships on the horizon, attack them at dawn. It didn't have anything for, could you please send the admiral's dispatches forthwith? It didn't have any. It didn't have any contingencies for that. So he decided to write his own, which he did. And it became the first edition of what became his famous signal code. And what he introduced to the story was the ability to tell a story. So instead of just having set phrases, he had set phrases, but he also had words. He had parts of words that you could kind of bolt on to other parts of words to make different words. So essentially, I mean, some historian, I think it was Chris Coelho, I don't know how you pronounce his name. I've just mangled it. But anyway, he described it as flag texting. which is a fairly light-hearted way of looking at it, but it's accurate. So instead, so you could put together whole sentences that weren't in the signal book, and you could use it for anything you wanted. You could even spell out words if you had all day. He did several editions of the signal code, made it better and better, expanded the vocabulary, and eventually it got adopted officially by the Navy, and was then used all the way into the 20th century. So it was pretty successful. It was his biggest legacy. And of course, Popham himself missed the Battle of Trafalgar because he was on a boat sailing to South Africa at the time, so he wasn't there. But Nelson used that signal code to signal that England expects every man to do his duty, or words to that effect, because it was versatile. So Popham was kind of present at the Battle of Trafalgar.
He is responsible for Nelson's message, in a way, the inspiring message. So he had an impact on the rest of the fleet.
He did, and he dined out on that story for years.
I can imagine. He seems like the kind of guy who would.
Oh yes, they're definitely not the kind of guy to rest on his laurels.
No, I could just see him swaggering into a gin shop with. Nelson's famous signal. I'm responsible for that. Drinks, please.
Yeah, that would exactly have been what he would have done. Absolutely.
Bring me some napkins and a pencil. I'll show you the scheme.
Yeah. Oh God. Oh. You wouldn't have wanted to get him started. He wouldn't have stopped.
Like when someone says to me, "Explain to me the Battle of Jutland." Well, we're not.
Yeah. No, Popham, about those signals. Yes. Whoa, signals!
Luckily, I have this presentation I carry around with me.
In fact, I had this pocket set of flags, which I had made specially for the occasion.
If I pull up this string, this is what this signal means. And it's just rubbish in my notebook. But what other kind of hijinks did he get involved in, other than invading South America for no good reason?
Haha. Yeah. Well, that's the most obvious one. But yeah, he was. I keep describing him as popping up everywhere, and in fact, my Twitter followers and I play a game called Popham Bingo, which is when he appears somewhere random. My followers will tag me in the post and go bingo, and he appears in these random places. He. Probably his biggest controversy before he went to South America was when he went to the Red Sea, where he was sent by Dundas. Actually, he was technically sent by the Admiralty on this occasion. He was meant to be transporting troops from one part of the Red Sea to the other. Excellent. This is he's really good at that sort of thing. The problem was he had at least two other sets of instructions, which the Admiralty didn't know about, which he'd been given by Dundas and the East India Company, where he was supposed to be making trade treaties with some of the Arab states lining the Red Sea. So this is when he started. He was actually given a ship to sail out to the Red Sea. So he had a ship. Yay! He hardly spent any time aboard the ship. Boo! Because he was doing his other job, which was to be unofficial and then official ambassador to the states along the Red Sea. He eventually secured an official appointment from the Governor General. So he spent a long time on shore, basically winding up the locals because he had all the diplomatic capacity of a brick. He really wasn't the best diplomat. His idea of a diplomatic gambit was to go up to one of the local rulers and hand him a present of a cannonball wrapped in a handkerchief. Just to drive in the point, So, hi, I'm here. I can flatten your city if you don't do what I want. Yeah, he was. That was his style, shall we say? So he didn't do particularly well, as you can imagine. He signed a couple of trade treaties, but he did overreach himself, and he was specifically told to stick to the sides of the Red Sea, stick to the coast, because the area was still under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, which was an ally of Britain at the time. So best not to piss him off by going and making independent treaties, not through the ambassador to the Ottoman court, but through this random naval captain. But Popham decided that he was going to go to Cairo
Because
anyway.
why not?
Yeah, why not? Because a trade treaty with Egypt, that would be amazing. Wonderful. And he messed up diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire for about a decade. The Ottoman Empire found out he'd done it, and they blew their tops. They were not happy. So he basically got a really long letter from the Governor General. I suspect the Governor General didn't need to send him the letter. He probably could just have shouted from Calcutta and been heard. He was that angry, saying,
Yeah.
"Stay in your lane,
Captain. Why aren't you on your ship?"
Well,
No.
that wasn't really the point at that stage, because he wasn't supposed to be on his ship for that job. However, he then got back to Britain, and he discovered that while he'd been away from his ship, and we don't know quite what happened here. I haven't quite worked out the ins and outs, but his ship had had a refit, and it had cost £80,000, which was more than had been spent on the entire squadron in the Indian Ocean in the same period. So the Admiralty, once they peeled themselves off the ceiling, started asking questions. So where, what, where, who, what?
I mean,
what?
you could almost buy your own, without quoting Luke Skywalker, you could almost buy your own ship for that at that sort of price.
Yeah, well, that's essentially what they said, and so Popham got into big trouble. And to cut a long story short, he was investigated over it for about 3 years, during which he wasn't actually able to serve abroad. He was eventually, Pitt and Dundas, his mates, came back into office and eventually cleared him. So that was okay. But still not quite sure what happened there. Some suggestion that he might have stolen some money, but I suspect that even Popham was clever enough to know that if he stole £80,000, someone was going to notice.
Yes.
So I think something just went badly wrong somewhere. I don't know where, and Popham was nowhere near his ship, so he wouldn't have had the qualifications to know. But what he was doing in those 3 years, and these are more shenanigans, which is fun. And I told you yesterday that I might mention submarines.
I was interested to see how he
was mucking about submarines. He didn't do it very long because he decided the submarine wasn't a goer. But he met this chap called Robert Fulton, who was an American. And Fulton had a couple of inventions that he wanted the British government to take on, and the British government just wasn't interested. So Fulton got hold of Popham, who he must have known was a bit of a sap for scientific inventions, and he said, "Look here, mate," except in an American accent, "I've got these here inventions. Would you like to have a look at them, and would you persuade the government to buy them?" And Popham decided they were the best things since sliced bread. Popham was always very enthusiastic about everything he took on. And because Pitt and Dundas were his mates, he persuaded them to take them on. And so he spent most of 1804 mucking about with submarines. And as I said, he decided he didn't really like them because they leaked, and they could only work if there wasn't any wind or tides, which actually wasn't ideal unless you were in a swimming pool. So, but he did take on another of Fulton's inventions, which was effectively a torpedo, and they were used on at least 2 occasions. Popham oversaw a raid on Boulogne and another one a couple of months later on Calais. Which were described as onlookers as very, very impressive to watch, a bit like a firework display, but absolutely, completely 100% pointless in terms of military effect. So that didn't work too well, but it kept him busy.
Was it
So there you go. I
Was
managed to get
Fulton
submarines in.
responsible for I think it was the Turtle during the War of Independence? Oh, right, the same guy.
Yes, that was it.
All right.
No, it wasn't him. That wasn't him. That was someone else. Oh
No,
God,
I
I can't
couldn't
remember the
remember
name of
when
the
you.
chap.
But it was just like it was a wooden sphere, wasn't it? And it was sort of pedalled by someone inside.
Yes, it wasn't. It wasn't Fulton. No, it wasn't Fulton, but it was
Hmm.
kind of an upgrade of that. It was supposed to be quite impressive. It was supposed to be well. It could act as a regular ship above water, and then it could also go underwater, which was obviously quite useful for a lot of things. Except, as I said, you couldn't use it if there was wind
rough weather.
Yeah, or anything really.
Yeah. And
So
even
yeah,
with my basic submarine knowledge, I know that if they leak, that's a problem.
yeah. Well, I think Popham did spend. I think he spent 15 minutes in one. So if it
No.
leaked, it didn't leak that quickly. But it leaked. I suspect it leaked enough for him to get his ankles.
And the thought of
so,
this is clearly a bad idea.
Yeah, I think at that stage he was probably thinking, you know what, blow this for a game of soldiers or not soldiers, as the case may be.
We need a volunteer.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm trying to read my handwriting. So what was the sort of the controversy? Start again. What was the controversy of sort of 1807 that he found himself in? Oh yes.
That was his court-martial. And then after the court, yes, there was a court-martial. Well, there were two controversies actually. There was a court-martial, which was probably the big one. But then he immediately got himself caught up in another controversy, which was that the government that had court-martialed him fell. Not because they court-martialed Popham, it was completely unrelated to that. And they were replaced by, obviously not Pitt, he being dead, but his followers. So Popham was suddenly flavour of the month again. And he had spent the entire trial banging on about how he was being politically victimised because the government was a Whig government and Pitt had been a Tory and he was Pitt's man. So the new government thought, well, I guess he's kind of our man, isn't he? Right, let's employ him. And they didn't just employ him. They gave him the post of captain of the fleet at the invasion of Copenhagen, which happened that summer. Now, again, I don't know how much your listeners know about what a captain of the fleet is. A captain of the fleet effectively was the ADC to the commanding admiral. So effectively a flag rank. So it put him senior to all the post captains in the fleet in one fell swoop. And he had a really important staff position. Essentially, the rest of the Navy went
understandably.
Yeah, and they went, what the hell? And three captains, senior captains, who actually served as commodores in the expedition, signed a letter to the Admiralty saying, we are not going to serve with this clown. And he is, undermining the reputation of the Navy. And what the hell are you doing? Even the commanding admiral Gambier said it wasn't my choice. I didn't do it.
Don't shout at me.
Yeah, exactly. And the Admiralty told the three captains to pipe down and get on with their jobs. But it was kind of the first sign that the court-martial had done a lot more damage to Popham than Popham realised, because the government still sent him out. He still served as captain of the fleet, but they got so much flack about it. There were questions asked about it in Parliament that they essentially refused to appoint him to that senior position ever again. And a few years later, there was an expedition to the island of Walcheren, which is no longer an island, but then was an island, in what is now the Netherlands. Some of your World War II listeners will certainly recognise the name of the place. And Popham had helped plan it, and he confidently expected to be captain of the fleet again. And he was not appointed.
Surprise.
And he got the commanding admiral and the general to push his case, and the Admiralty still refused because they'd been burnt already. They weren't going to do that again. No way. So it was kind of the first sign that things were not going as well for him as they had been.
And they kind of promote him sideways to Jamaica, don't they? To sort of get rid of him.
Oh yeah, that's at the end of his life. So yeah, I mean, that wasn't. Yeah, his career from 1807 kind of goes downhill. No, it doesn't nosedive exactly, but it kind of. He never. Well, Pitt was dead. Dundas was out of office, and in 1811 also died. So he didn't have his two best friends in office anymore, and he blotted his copybook so thoroughly at Walcheren. I don't know if any of your listeners know anything about Walcheren, but it was a disaster, shall we just say. Let's leave it at that, full stop, moving on. And because he was so intimately involved in that, after that, they didn't touch him for about 2 years. They sent him on blockade duty, which
is a very dull duty as well.
He hated being bored, and leaving him to be bored was really bad. So eventually the government decided, okay, fine, him being bored is not a good thing. Let's send him to the peninsula. They sent him for a few months to the peninsula, where he liaised with Wellington for a while, and with the local guerrillas. But again, his diplomatic incapability didn't help, and he wasn't sent back out. He managed
probably
to
telling them about how signals work.
And he essentially. Yeah, well, actually, yes, he did. He said to Wellington, "We need a cipher for our correspondence." Wellington said, "We really don't, you know." And Popham said, "Look, I've got one already. Here's my signal book." Wellington's kind of, "We really don't need a cipher," and Popham's kind of, "No, I insist. Here's my signal book." So yeah,
he really does sound like one of those tedious guys at a dinner party. He's like, "I've written a book. We should read it all."
It absolutely was. But yeah, so he essentially missed the last couple of years of the war because he wasn't being employed. And after the war, he got, as a kind of quote unquote reward, I'm doing air quotes in the air here, he got sent to Jamaica as commander-in-chief of the Jamaica station, which really wasn't a bad posting on the face of things. Quite a lucrative station. Lots of merchant vessels coming in from Admiral to cream a percentage off. He was promoted to Admiral in 1814. I forgot to mention that bit. But he went out with his family, and that was a big mistake because he lost 2 of his children to the climate. He had 10 children with his wife. He lost 2 of them in Jamaica. And it destroyed his own health, and he had to come back in June 1820. And he died 2 months later of a stroke, and he was only 58. So it's a bit of a sad ending, really.
To an amazing career.
I don't think any lives end happily, but well, my parents were here at the weekend, and my mother said, "Don't tell me how it ends until he dies." So yeah, I don't know what she was expecting, really.
Spoiler alert: he's dead. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, he's been dead for over 200 years. Gosh, fancy that.
That's that.
So yeah, slightly sad end.
Yeah.
Poor buddy.
He's had such a really interesting and varied career that I just can't get over the fact that he's been involved in like 3 pretty nasty scandals: Buenos Aires, and the losing £80,000 when getting your ship refitted, and that he just seems to keep bouncing back as like, "Hey, it's me again. I've got my code book." No.
Yeah.
Bugger the code book. And we need you for an amphibious thing. Cool, yeah, no problem.
Oh yeah. Yep, yeah. He does. He's I guess like a cat, as I said, lands on his feet. Except when he doesn't. But yeah.
But this genuinely has been really interesting, and I'm going to have to grab myself a copy of the book. Could you just remind everyone the title of your book? And it should be out sort of nowish, shouldn't it?
Allegedly it's out already, although Amazon hasn't caught up with that and still thinks it will be delivered in November. But I'm assured that it is published and it should be out within a couple of days of ordering. It's the Quicksilver Captain, the Improbable Life of Sir Home
Yes,
Popham.
you know what?
And it's available through Hellion, which is the publisher, and also on Amazon.
Yes,
if that's your poison.
Although we will try and get it on the History Hack website so that you're not sponsoring that particular website in the creation of Death Stars, which I've been told they're allegedly getting on with. Allegedly.
Jesus. Okay, well, yeah, yes. You can definitely get it through.
They
Hellion,
are not building
anyway.
a Death Star.
Yes. No, I don't think they've got the budget, but
no.
Don't give them ideas.
There's management meeting over in Hellion now. It's like we could build a Death Star. So yeah, okay.
Yeah. Oh, I hadn't thought of that. Gosh. Yeah, there goes my next contract. Sorry, all our money is now channeled into the Death Star.
Well, Amazon have got through. Anyway, yeah. So wandering off. Yeah. And this is why I'm not allowed. I should edit things, but
it's more fun as it is. I think
I will try and if you've got this far, to any listeners, if you've got this far, and you didn't hear a bit in the middle where I completely disappeared, I did manage to edit something. So, but thank you ever so much for coming on to speak to us today in this really rather random format. And this really does sound interesting, and I really encourage everyone to go out and read about this, because I think this guy needs more people to know about his life.
I agree.
And
well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And let's hit the stop. There we go.